Hello. So why am I particularly pleased to be with finance people today, this morning, you will ask? I had this very short-lived debate with the leader of the French Green Movement. So for the non-French here, there is a French Green Movement. And there is a leader, at least that's what she said. And I asked her on TV, well, are you for or against capitalism? And she replied, well, I'll have to think about it. And, well, probably you will help me answer that question today, but it's clearly a question that needs to be addressed when you want to lead a green transition or a green transformation. So to introduce me in a few words, I would say I would call myself a philosopher in the field. So for the past 10 years, I've mixed theories and experiments. So I did some reporter's work around freedom in the world. I visited open prisons in Finland, direct democracy in Switzerland, drug legalization in the US, entrepreneurs in Rwanda, or basic income in Brazil. So I tried to see all those communities here on Earth who try to live more free. Then I did a world tour on AI, questioning whether that technology is in fact liberating us or not. And the answer is rather not, to be frank, which is why my next journey was on a horse through Europe, meeting with ordinary people and asking for food and shelter. Then I tried to lead, or at least to mount a political campaign in France, failed to do so, and came back where I am now, which is gardening in Normandy. So you see my ambitions are really from freedom in the world to beans and growing beans in my garden. They're a bit narrowing down. Now, my intellectual background is classical liberalism. I would imagine that most of you share broad lines of that philosophy: market economy, representative democracy, freedom of speech, individual rights, small or smaller government. It's all what you can read in The Economist, basically. And then I came across the issue of the environment, which was not part of my natural intellectual upbringing. I came across it when I was on that horse, because obviously we were immersed into nature and we kept on meeting with farmers. I wrote a novel called Humus, so on soils and living soils. And of course, it's a world that I discovered, how soils function. And then obviously it leads to the question whether our conception of human freedom for the past 2 centuries is not clearly in collision and endangering the world that we live in. And the question we have to ask ourselves before we can move on to practical plans is how to maintain the liberal fabric of our societies while not destroying the planet. I mean, obviously, it doesn't make sense to speak about freedom or think about freedom if you can't live any longer. And that's what I found out in writing my latest essay, called Agrophilosophy, is that question is in fact at the heart of classical liberalism. In the midst of the 19th century, you probably know the work of Alexis de Tocqueville, at least by name, traveled through America, made the theory of democracy. And what you may not know is that after his journey in America, Tocqueville took a break with his good friend Gustave de Beaumont, and they went on a ride. And that ride was through the forest of Michigan. And they were, at the time, primary forests, untouched by man. In those forests, they met with indigenous communities. And then you can see another Tocqueville marveling at nature, marveling at the birds, marveling at the fact that, for instance, in those forests, as opposed to any forest in Europe, the dead trunks are left rooting on the ground because nobody is there to transfer them, to cultivate them. And Tocqueville thinks, well, that's a fantastic alliance of life and death, and it's so vivid, and it's so rich, and it's so pure. And he says, all that will disappear. All that will vanish. Because of that revolution that also I call for otherwise. And you see that misgiving, that contradiction, between development and nature is really at the roots of liberalism and explains why liberalism and the environmental movement have always been at odds with each other over the past 2 centuries. Now, what do we say when we say the planet and we should not destroy the planet and we need to take care of the planet? I mean, what's the planet? Because the planet, most of the planet is a rock with no particular interest. So when we say we need to save the planet, we think of something much more accurate than the planet. Is that layer of humus, of living soil, which is maybe 20, 30 inches deep, that goes around the planet, and without which you wouldn't have any life over it. Let me say a few words, because maybe most of you don't know what's under their feet. We forgot about that. You have billions of creatures. Those creatures weigh more than all the mammals on Earth. Billions of creatures consisting of earthworms, bacteria, mushrooms, that work relentlessly to do what? To disintegrate organized bodies that are dead, vegetal or animal, and transform them into very small elements, very small molecules, who can then be again absorbed by plants and contribute to the cycle of life. Which means what? That without the soil, the corpses, our dead bodies would just accumulate into space and block any possibility of evolution. So by destroying those bodies, they allow natural evolution to take place. They allow novelty to emerge, and they allow progress to be made. So what I would say is that the soils are giving us the rhythm of life on Earth. You need about 1,000 years to build a soil from nothing, from a bedrock. Which explains why we have all the time to curate our cities and our monuments. Because all the time, soil is starting to appear. That's what's called pedogenesis, the birth of soil. Why do we have to wash out the fronts of our buildings every 2 decades? It's not because of pollution. It's because that thin layer of black matter that you see on the buildings, it's soil coming out. And when you leave a city without doing nothing for 40 years, as we did with Chernobyl, you see that it's already a forest, because the roots of the trees have cracked, all our constructions, all our concrete, and very quickly the soil reappears, and the soil destroys everything, which is why the ruins are underneath our feet. The ruins are not above, not because they sink, but because, and so Darwin found that out in his latest book on earthworm at the end of the 19th century, why are ruins beneath the ground? It's not because they've sunk into the ground, it's because the ground has come over them, it's been transported and carried by billions of earthworms for centuries, those lowly organized creatures, as Darwin says, and at the end, the soil has come over them. So you see, it gives, and what we try to do as a civilization, what we try to do is we try to build added value. So we try to build eternity. We try to build artworks, artifacts, monuments that resist that pressure of the soil that always comes to destroy and to rejuvenate. And that's also why, obviously, our humanity comes, etymologically speaking, and for those who believe, religiously speaking, from humus. But those soils, we ignored them. We ignored them philosophically. Plato in the, I have to find out the Theaetetus. Theaet is translated by Theaetetus. So Plato in the Theaetetus writes the story of Socrates, who sees Thales, another philosopher, and that Thales is walking into a field, and obviously at the time, philosophers were also mathematicians and astronomers, and he's looking up at the skies. He's looking up at the skies, and then he falls into a hole. And there comes a servant a female servant from Thrace, and she shouts at Thales, well, you idiot, stop looking at the skies. Look at what's beneath your feet. And that's something that we haven't done until Darwin. The science of soil has only emerged at the end of the 19th century. So we know very little. It is estimated that we know only 1% of the living species that constitute our soils. But although we know very little, we don't protect and we don't take care of our soils. We mistreat them by deep plowing and chemical inputs, which today leads to a situation where 60% of European soils, according to the European Commission, are degraded. They are degrading. That means what? That means that you have no life into those soils, so they are just a surface. And that surface becomes mud when it rains, becomes dust when it's too dry, and is not fertile any longer. And it's quite, it's really quite a leap to understand what we've destroyed. We've destroyed what makes our humanity, that humus, and we are being, in doing so, etymologically speaking, we are being inhuman. And that destruction only mirrors, obviously, and that's my entry point, if you want, into the ecological question, that mirrors the collapse of biodiversity. You probably know that we have entered into the sixth mass extinction, and that means what? That means that over the last 50 years, 3/4 of the populations of living beings on Earth, wild living beings, have disappeared, 3/4. And that's something you can see with your own eye. When you drive a car, you have no more insects on your windscreen. And when you walk in the fields in the spring, you don't hear birds anymore. 60% of birds in cultivated land have also been wiped out. And obviously, it's not, it's obviously correlated to climate change, but it's not directly linked with climate change. And when we think of the environment now, we think a lot about energy and about carbon emission. But unfortunately, that's only one small side of the story. The bigger story is the disappearance of life. The main two factors of the collapse of biodiversity are not climate change. They are the destruction of natural habitats and the exhaustion of resources from which those living beings can thrive. So if you make a thought experiment, if you imagine that tomorrow we have invented some fantastic geoengineering tool to evacuate all the carbon that we don't need from the skies, is that the end of the story? Not at all, because if you have no bees that pollinate, you will have no trees, you will have no fruits. Already in China, they are trying to pollinate by hand because you have no insects any longer to do that job. So I don't want to make you anxious, but at the same time, it would be completely irrational today not to be anxious. And to quote Tocqueville again, the very last sentence of democracy in America is about the threat that some sort of authoritarian democracy can pose on human liberty. And Tocqueville says, I don't want to engulf you into anguish. I want to prompt that salutary fear that will cause you to act. And that salutary fear is maybe what we call today eco-anxiety, but it's something that should be turned into positive. Now, if you take into account that question of life, obviously it changes your perspective on freedoms from a very fundamental manner. I'll take only one example among so many, property rights. Property rights which are really at the roots, and I have really promoted property rights, including on the issue on AI. I've always said that we should have property rights on our own data that would transform the digital market into something much more democratic, because the value producer at the beginning of the chain would be rewarded for what he creates for his capital, which is his body, his data. So I'm not, philosophically against property rights. But we have to acknowledge that property rights have been sought and built around a form of domination of man on nature. How so? The modern founder of our notion of property rights is John Locke. John Locke, end of the 17th century, in the second treatise of civil government. We are in the midst of the Glorious Revolution in the UK. And let me quote Locke. So he wants to understand, why do we own things? And he takes the example of the apple tree. And here what he writes. Someone who eats the apples he gathered from the trees in the forest has certainly appropriated them to himself. Nobody can deny that the nourishment is his. Well then, when did they begin to be his? When he digested them? When he cooked them? When he brought them home? When he picked them up under the tree? And depending on which answer you give to those questions, you end up with very different political philosophies. The answer of Locke, obviously, is when I pick them up. When I pick them up, I make an effort. I work, I labor, I mix my body, which I own, with my environment, and so I can appropriate my environment. Good enough in a world or in an abstract social contract which only envisages the relationship from individual to individual. Now, what happens if ecosystems come into play? Well, then you could say to Locke, hold on, that apple is not there by miracle. It's there because you had earthworms, you had water, you had bees. So you have a very complex ecosystem without which this apple wouldn't have existed. So what do? Do we share the property rights with those billions of little beings? Or do we re-envisage our own property rights to associate them with duties? Duties to maintain or to increase the biodiversity around us. So what do we do now? So, my point is, yes, I mean, there is a big tension between the environment and the very tenets of our social contracts. Now, what do we do? Well, the first option that we are very good at doing is nothing. The point I want to make is that doing nothing is very much in keeping with our biological constitution. Marc-André Selosse, who is a biologist, which I really recommend, and writes excellent vulgarization books, makes that point that natural evolution doesn't lead to natural equilibrium. It's something that can be extremely cruel. It's something that can be mismanaged. It's something that can fail. And yes, some natural species have exhausted their own resources and have disappeared because of that. So we wouldn't be the first one. And in fact, natural evolution commands us to look for our individual short-term interests rather than for the collective interests of the group. No species do that in nature. And Selosse takes the example, which I relish personally, of long-tailed macaques in the Coram Islands near Thailand. So those macaques, what they do, they live out of shellfish. And they have to open the oysters and other shellfish with tools. Because they're overpopulated, they're too numerous. So they ended up eating all the big oysters. They're left with the smaller oysters. And obviously, natural evolution commands the smaller oysters to develop more than the big ones who are threatened by the macaques. So you have a lot of small oysters. What do? They develop new tools. Oh, they're clever, they're technological. And with those new tools, they can open the smaller oysters. So they gain maybe 1 century of life expectancy for the species, and then for sure they will all disappear because you won't have any oyster left. So those who go for drill, baby, drill, those who go for fracking, they are long-tailed macaques. And they are in keeping with their biological beings. Those who are always, the techno-solutionists, they're not particularly doing a leap into culture. They're actually very much backwards. Well, the other option is obviously to leave nature alone. And that's the whole philosophy of rewilding, which is very powerful today. I won't have time to dwell on that, but I think it's somehow misdirected, because leaving nature alone means that you imprison man into cities to make synergies on one hand, and on the other hand, you leave nature alone as if you were reverting to some state of nature that would reach by miracle its own balance, its own equilibrium. And we know that nature is always adapting and that it doesn't reach any particular equilibrium. What we really need to do, that's my option, is to do that cultural leap to redefine human freedom. Not to abandon it, but to redefine it. You remember the distinction of Benjamin Constant. You have ancient freedom, it's because you participate into some collective action. You're part of the city-state. Then the modern freedom is about the individual, all-powerful. That goes all the way to the Homo Deus of Yuval Harari, the idea that you can be autonomous and you can do whatever you please, and you can go at very small cost wherever you want, and you can watch whatever movie at whatever time. And we have to admit that this definition has reached its limits. And we should try to define some form of eco-freedom where, in keeping with the cycle of the humus, you act in a balanced manner with your environment, and that balance gives you, in fact, the security and the independence that you need to feel free. I have to skip a few things because I really want to address with you the question of capitalism. Let's say we have, well-defined that eco-freedom and whatever. So what do we do with what you do, guys? I suppose invest capital and look at markets. And there I think we could suggest to de-link two notions that are too often associated, which are growth on one hand and capitalism on the other. What is growth? Growth is building an added value. But that added value, in the long term, will disappear because everything will be destroyed by the humus, remember, even if it takes a century or 1,000 or 1,000,000 years. It will crumble. It will be delinked itself. So growth is only an anticipation of time, which doesn't really make sense because things that grow needs to degrow at some point. And that's even a law of biophysics, which is called entropia. And on that law, you can do nothing. That's it. The world moves towards disorder. So by doing growth, you delay that disorder, and you make it even bigger after some time. On a more practical scale, one has to acknowledge that some countries, like the USSR, were clearly not capitalists, but at the same time looking for growth in a very classical industrial way. So what I suggest to do is John Stuart Mill, who was he was a contemporary of Tocqueville, they had a correspondence, and he was promoting what he called at the time stationary state. Because already at the time, John Stuart Mill had a debate with a French economist on growth. And he said, well, you cannot grow on finite resources, which is quite obvious. So that debate that we have since the Meadow Report of '72 has already been in existence since actually the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And John Stuart Mill said, well, and John Stuart Mill is a liberal, wrote a fantastic book on freedom, and he said, no, we need to reach exactly something that would be consistent with the cycle of humus, which is a stationary state. Now, within the stationary state, how do you allocate capital? How do you split resources? That's something that the market could very well do. What does it mean practically speaking for you? Well, it means that if you start giving economic value to soil, for instance, I think it could change the way you invest. Today, from one estimate, the ecosystem represents more than 2 times the GDP, the annual GDP on Earth. If you factor that into your equation, then farmers would change the way they farm land, they cultivate land, because obviously they would have to take into account the capital that they have, and they have to economically factor that capital into their productivity ratios. I'll make it short to finish. Just to tell you that very concretely, if very hypothetically somebody in this room had power, the first thing you would need is a plan towards agroecology. That needs, something very classical, rules. For instance, like for combustion engine vehicles, you could say in Europe by 2035, no more chemical inputs, no more dig ploughing into the fields. That's a very simple rule. With that simple rule, which is heavily constraining, you don't need all the small regulations that harass the farmers today. And you say that's the objective. And because that's the objective, then you can let the market find, the market in a very general sense, find the solutions. And that agroecology means, obviously, to focus on nature-based solution, and that solves a lot of problems, agronomical problems, water problems, carbon problems, because obviously you dig in carbon, and obviously you increase your biodiversity because you bet on the biodiversity to increase your ratios when you produce crop. That agroecological revolution is a political matter, as agriculture has always been. Remember the physiocrats in the 18th century? They started the French Revolution by thinking about the soils and how we cultivate the soils. Roosevelt, 1 century ago, during the Dust Bowl in America, which was this big cloud of dust provoked by too heavy ploughing, was already saying that a nation that destroys its soils destroys itself. So this is not only a matter for farmers, this is a matter for us all. And to do that, you obviously need that existential transformation, what Élisée Reclus called to rehabilitate the sentiment of nature into modern societies. So my advice for you today is invest in soils rather than AI and spend your holidays hiking. Thank you.
Before letting you go, and as a transition to our panel, I'd love to hear you as well on the notion of narratives and how novel, essaying, and art in general, to your opinion, is an element of the action plan that needs to be mobilized.
Well, yes, now I leave the politics to others. Well, obviously, I think, it's very basic to say that, but through a novel, so I wrote a novel on humus, the next one is on water, so I'm doing the 4 elements. And obviously, you reach a broader audience. But the main point is a novel doesn't have to reach conclusions. And so you can open different ways, and the reader can make his own mix. And and then makes his own journey. And that's very important because in an essay, you're always tempted to tell people what to do. And that's always frustrating. And that creates a lot of backlash. And very often the readers of my novel ask me, but okay, what do you think? And I said, if you ask the question, it's because it's a good novel. You don't know what I think. And because you don't know what I think, you can appropriate that story much better, because you'll find your own interpretation and your own path. And you don't find yourself obliged to embrace such idea or concept or whatever. So then, yes, you also need concepts, and I'm trying to do that in my essays. But I think fiction is, first of all, for me, much more pleasant to write, but also more open. And not only you reach a broader audience, but also your audience is, less.
Different state of mind.
Yeah, well.
Totally. Thank you very much.
That's it. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.